What's up, everybody? We know the last thing that you need is another fitness podcast just to catch you up on the newest trends, the fad diets, gossip in the industry, with nothing to take away from it. Enter myself, Marianna, here with me. We made Fitness Stuff for Normal People, the podcast to make exercise and nutrition science practical. Our goals are to expose misinformation in the industry by providing only evidence-based education, where today we're doing a follow-up episode on what we published last week. Last week, we talked about how to set up your calorie deficit. Today, we're doing a follow-up where we are talking about how to lose weight without tracking your calories, without tracking your macros at all. That's what we're following up with today. So Marianna's going to be our leader, essentially. We're going to grab onto her hand and go with it. Marianna, how's Boston?
Boston is hot. It's like 98% humidity. In California, I don't think it gets like that, does it?
Move to San Diego. That fixes all your that's whenever someone's like, you know what, I have a problem with where I'm living, I'm going to just fix it.
I don't
Move to San
have
Diego.
enough
Boom.
problems yet.
All your
Boston.
problems disappear.
I don't. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. So today we're going to get started, and what we're going to try and do special about today is give you guys applied takeaways of specific goals you can start doing today. Because last week we realized, as we were talking about setting up your calorie deficit, although one is needed for meaningful weight loss, right? There's no way around that. That also doesn't mean that you have to track every single calorie. You don't have to track even at all to see weight loss. Millions of people have done it before. Millions more will do it. We're just giving you some, we'll call them guardrails, to set up in your life to naturally push yourself into eating in a calorie deficit without really paying attention to it, without having that overwhelming thought in your head. Is guardrails a good word? I use guardrails almost like on a highway.
To
keep you in line, keep you out of danger. Stay in your lane. So we'll call them guardrails today. We're setting up guardrails for you guys into eating with this. So Marianna, I know we want to get started a little bit old school, but we're going to go over, I think, 5 or 6 different guardrails that we can set up. But do you think it's worth going over one more time, that it is necessary, and like explaining what a calorie deficit is, how weight loss works? Or do you think we should just refer back to the last episode?
Just run through it, and also you can listen to the last episode for a more detailed explanation. But really, you need to be consuming less energy than you are burning throughout the day. Is that like a good enough, really short explanation?
Yep, let's move on. No, that's good. Yeah, burning more energy than you have coming in. Energy, of course, we know means calories now, right? So if you want a more detailed, I think the first 10, 15 minutes, we really fully explained what a calorie deficit looks like, what it means, why it is a necessity, not just a dieting method. I would refer back, go listen to that if you don't. But today, we're going to talk about how, bumped my freaking camera. We're going to talk about how to put yourself in one without needing to track, because tracking can have a lot of downsides, from your mental health, from just feeling overwhelming, from being, half the episode we talked about how challenging it is in the first place. So today we're going to be talking about the few things you can do to go into it. Now, Marianna, your background in nutrition, catch people up a little bit on why you put these where you put them today before we go into them.
I really think I get sciencey for a lot of people that know me. I have my Master's of Science in Biochemical and Molecular Nutrition. However, my concentration was in communications and behavior change. And a lot of behavior change practices came from, in terms of my focus, people who have a history of yo-yo dieting, restrictive dieting, poor relationship with food. They're really trying to maybe improve their overall health, lose a little bit of weight. However, they do have that history of not having the best relationship with tracking their calories, feeling like they were controlled by MyFitnessPal, not really understanding how to make decisions, how to eat without some sort of external source or strict, rigid diet guiding them. So that's what I practice a lot with a lot of my clients, is people have a lot of that background and experience with eating and weight loss and dieting, and a lot of people have been through it. I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to that. And it's shit, for lack of a better term, what our society puts out there in terms of how to lose weight. And these are really what we're going to get into and break down. Lifestyle approaches that I would say, Tony, you can argue against this if you want, but even if you do track your calories, I think all these are good guides, guardrails for you as well, even if you can track, have a good relationship there, feel comfortable with it.
Oh, 1,000%. Yeah, 1,000%. This makes tracking easier just because, again, these guardrails naturally put you in a state where you're just consuming less total food. So, of course, that's just as helpful whether you're tracking or not. Of course, we're going to design the episode around when you're not, but if you're tracking food, that doesn't just magically make eating the right food easier. You just are paying attention to it a little bit more, which we know meaningful weight loss takes a long time. So these behavior changes are typically what's going to get you there. Like any diet with an end date or any training plan with an end date, like it's just usually not going to work because meaningful progress takes time. So that's why we're running these down. So let's start with number one, and we're not going to rank these in any order particularly. You could probably take 3 or 4 of the 5 or 6 that we're doing and really implement them starting today, whichever ones speak to you. This whole approach, let's reiterate it like 1,000 more times, is based on you coming from your point of view, your lifestyle. Some of these will fit very well, very easy. Yeah. Some of these will not. The goal is to put the right ones in, see which ones you think will work, trial and error. If one works, keep it. If you try something it doesn't, kick it out. So let's go ahead and start off with number 1 is we're talking about throwback to like the one nutrition principle everyone got in school for like 20 minutes before they brushed over it. Portion sizes. This is not a little one because it's probably the most impactful one, especially in the United States, that we forgot about. Mm-hmm. Portion sizes. Yeah, so talk about it. Teach me about it.
Portion sizes, I would say, can be the most straightforward in terms of, reduce your portion sizes. But from actually putting this into action and changing it and understanding which portions are for you is one of the most difficult concepts and lifestyle approaches to losing weight for people to grasp, yet it is essential. It's essential, and it's also, there's a lot of trial and error there. Mm-hmm. So in order to make this a little bit simpler, because obviously not everyone has the same portion sizes. Everyone is different, and you can use a little rule of thumb when it comes to how can I know what a proper portion is for me. A lot of that comes down to how am I building my plate, how am I building a meal. So I call this a balanced plate method. This isn't my method I came up with. We're breaking it down to the basics of back when Michelle Obama was in office, and my plate and guiding how to build a plate. All of those principles were based in how to get the proper macro and micronutrient needs that are determined by your RDA for the day. So it's really basic. I'll break it down simply here, but you can go with an average size dinner plate, which is tough. I'm not talking about like a salad plate, appetizer plate, but like a decent dinner plate, which is tough because we have large.
How big are we talking?
Wherever, if you buy something and it's labeled as a dinner plate, I feel like that is a good enough guide because it's tough.
We'll call it that. And even if you're off by an inch or so, we're not talking about freaking cookie platters. Mm-hmm. No one's going to assume that's a dinner plate. So when we split up the dinner plate, what do we do with it?
For half of your plate to be veggies, and these can really be any vegetables you want. Leaning towards the high fiber end, and we'll talk about why later. A quarter of your plate to be protein, and this is where you can mess around a little bit. If you are, say, strength training a lot, exercising a lot, you may increase that to around a third to even half of your plate. And you can adjust your carbs, which I recommend to be a quarter of your plate. And fats, healthy fats, around 2 tablespoons, which is like 2 spoonfuls. So again, protein is where I would say there's a little bit of flexibility there, just depending on, I'm hungrier, I just worked out, I want a little bit more protein, I'm gonna reduce my carbs a bit. But this is just a general guide, and this is gonna help you get in your macronutrient needs as well as your micronutrient needs. And it's also going to help with satiation. There is not much processed foods in there. And maybe we can link this. I'm gonna pause here for a second, but I have PDFs. I can get them ready and adjust them for if people want to download what this looks like, a downloadable.
Yeah, we'll put downloadable PDFs down below.
So I'll insert downloadable PDFs for what this looks like and also how to do this. So what are some examples of some veggies, some proteins, some healthy fats, some carbs, and also how can I do this throughout the day in a way that's going to work for me. So again, sometimes this might not satisfy everyone. Even if you have your plate, you build it like this. And this is a big thing to keep in mind in terms of hunger and fullness. monitoring your hunger and fullness cues, I think that could almost be a separate one, but while you're building this, so after you eat your meal, say you're done with it, and you still feel hungry, always listen to your hunger. If your hunger is extremely high, even after you're done eating, and I'm talking like you feel like you could go for a full serving of seconds, go and cut that portion in half. So say whatever you did a quarter of your plate protein, we're going to cut that in half and have that portion. Okay, now I'm going to eat that, and then I'm going to wait like 15 to 20 minutes to evaluate if I'm still hungry after. So always reminding yourself, this portion size may still be too small for me, or I may get full before I finish eating it. So monitoring those hunger and fullness cues is also really important, and there's also flexibility here.
I think pausing to one, think about it. I'm hungry now, but let's give it 10 minutes. Let's see if we are still hungry in 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And two, it's like, different people are going to have different sizes. So if me and you have the same plate, all of our clients, I'm a larger human, so I'm probably going to need a little bit more. If you're listening to your hunger cues over time, most people typically, I think, do you think overconsumption a lot of the time just comes from not paying attention to those hunger cues in the first place? Like most people, and I've had clients like this too, who just are moving away from tracking. I think it's a great like weaning off method. If you're stressed out about overeating in social situations, like just ask yourself, am I hungry right now? Am I eating this out of hunger, or am I eating this out of whatever other reason? And most of the time people are like, oh, I'm not hungry. It just takes that brief pause to ask yourself that question, doesn't it? So I think that's a big piece of it in understanding your specific sizes too.
That are like, what are you talking about? I know when I'm hungry and when I'm full, that's crazy. But then there are also going to be people who are listening that have absolutely no idea how to control, like when they're hungry, when they're full, how to understand when to stop before being uncomfortably full. So this can also be really helpful. A little tip that I give, this is a little bit more like something I do one-on-one, but before you even eat, if you are that person that really struggles to identify hunger, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm absolutely ravenous, and then a 0 being, oh my God, no, I don't want food. 5 in the middle, like, oh, I'm pretty comfortable. Monitor your hunger, rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. And say if you're going into that meal and you're around like 8, 9, or 10, you're super, super hungry. Afterwards, also rate your fullness. Like, are you uncomfortably full after you went into that meal super, super, super hungry? Oftentimes you will be. So that's how you can start to learn, okay, this is what it feels like. Again, that's more individualized approach. However, I think it can be really helpful for some people.
Yeah. I know I struggle with that if I'm going into a meal starving. Like I've learned just to try and set my days up to where I'm not going into something starving, because just giving yourself a second to pause is way easier said than done. Because if I'm going in something starving, I will stuff my face and then I'm laying on the couch afterwards like, what the heck did I just do? It's so much easier to eat straight through any hunger cue of like, I'm full, until after you're done eating, putting everything done, the plate's cleared, and you're like, holy crap, I could not eat another bite. Until it's too late. That pause is hard
and
too.
So that's going to happen. It's part of being human. But the goal is to be like, on the days where you did overeat, you felt uncomfortably full. Oh, I knew I skipped lunch that day, or I didn't really eat enough protein after my workout, and I waited too long to eat. Even just identifying those patterns throughout your day, that is a sign of progress, because you're starting to pay attention a little bit more to behaviors that maybe promote overeating, so that you're more conscious to not do those behaviors in the future. So again, there's no concrete answer, but a lot of it is behavior change based and understanding yourself and how you act around food.
Yeah. That reminds me too of the G form that we put together a while back. Do you remember? I've used it with several clients. I know you use it with several clients, of the daily check-in at the end of the day, to where it's okay, maybe you don't have the time or the just capacity in your head to pause every single time you're eating, but at the end of the day, we'd have some of our clients even just fill it out come 7, 8 o'clock, just looking back at their day, saying, okay, how many times did I eat past I was comfortable? How many times did I find myself starving? Like, just remembering, if you do that each day of the week, you'll quickly notice patterns like, oh, I'm starving going into lunch almost every day, or I've always overeaten at nighttime. Those are patterns. And once you identify where those are, you can start to fix them. I think that's so huge, is just paying attention to it in figuring that out. So one, right, would be look at your freaking portion sizes and pay attention to when you're hungry, when you're full. And let me just remind you this, because I actually looked this up right before. In America too, especially if you're listening to this somewhere around the globe, in America, we're like pretty well known for having massive portion sizes compared to other countries. Like people that visit from America to Italy, to Ireland, whatever, order their food and they think it's like the appetizer because they're like, there's no way this is my main course because it's so small. I remember even one small report going over, I don't want to mispronounce the name, but a group of Indians from Mexico. They followed them as they moved to America. And within 5 weeks, they on average put on 10 pounds just because of the style of eating that quickly changed. That's not uncommon to see. So if you're in America, we do struggle with large portion sizes. And I think this is even more important when you're eating out, to start paying attention. You don't have to eat the whole plate of food that comes out. You can save it for seconds or give it to homeless people on the way out. Pay attention to when you're filling up. So number one is paying attention to portion size and your hunger cues. Number two, and this is big, is looking at processed foods. Or how would you map this out of something? Here's takeaway number two, what we can do to
focusing
help
on
this.
making the majority of your bigger meals throughout the day whole foods based. I hate to say like whole foods or like it's not like real food. These are not ultra processed foods coming in a package. So breaking down your plate is like,
I know, I kind of got the ick when you said that too.
The method we were just talking about, those are all whole foods. So a protein source, veggies, whole grains. It's not like clean or unclean. It's really just processed. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that. I got
Me
the ick when you, because I hate the whole foods or ultra, like it sounds gross, but it's like, okay, when we're saying whole foods, yeah, it's meaning it's coming from fruits, from veggies, from lean, like just protein sources, like actual foods. And I think that's a good cover. Like we're not saying processed foods are inherently bad for you on their own. I think like what you were saying earlier, it's a highly processed diet as a whole that's dangerous. Having a piece of processed foods, if it's a Reese's cup, if it's anything else, it's not going to be bad for you. It's not going to be good for you. It's if your whole diet is made up more of these highly processed foods. That's when it's easy to overconsume without even knowing it, correct?
The biggest thing here is that ultra processed foods are ultra palatable. They're very easy to overeat, and they're also calorie dense foods. So if you look at a small serving of, say, potato chips, they would have this, like, say if it's like a small serving this big, and then you look at a strawberry, which again, there's no comparison. They aren't even on the same level, but I'm just explaining calorie density. So you would need a lot more strawberries to have the same amount of calories as that small amount of chips. So that's just a comparison there. And because they are so palatable, they are very easy to overeat and they're delicious. It is great to have some ultra processed foods here and there every now and then, but when they become the center of your diet and what you eat the majority of the time, weight loss is going to be extremely difficult. Weight gain is going to be much easier depending on the person.
Yeah. I was going to say on potato chips too. That's I think one of the best ones is who's actually having one small serving, which is what, like 9 chips, I think on the bag, or 11 chips sometimes. There's a decent amount of calories. If you can just have one serving of chips, yeah, that's pretty good. But how likely are you to consume 3, 4, 5, 6 servings of that food? If a servings of strawberries is 1 cup, how likely are you to eat 6 cups of strawberries by accident? You don't just keep going back for cups.
Because
way harder to overconsume.
That is when you center, say, your larger meals throughout the day. I don't like to give an exact number because there's no best number, but your larger meals throughout the day, if they are centered around whole foods, you will be less likely to overeat these ultra processed foods, even if you have them for a snack, because you're satisfied. You're not really hungry. Again, having really high hunger, it's harder to make those conscious decisions around food. I want to talk about this study that investigated whether ultra processed foods affect energy intake. And again, this was only in 20 people, so a smaller study, but it was a randomized controlled study, and the outcomes were actually really fascinating. So again, these people were randomized to either receive an ultra-processed diet, so follow an ultra-processed diet for 2 weeks, followed by an alternate diet of whole foods based. And they weren't given any calorie restrictions. They could eat as much. Just
eat like you normally would, like no goal in mind, not to lose weight, not to gain weight, just eat these foods.
Yep. And
this is your source.
So each group, so either you started on the ultra-processed and then went to a more whole foods-based diet. Each of those diets, the calories were matched. So they were still eating the same, recommended to eat like the same calories in a day. However, that's not how it worked out. Energy intake was greater during the ultra processed diet. So by around 500 calories.
What?
So these people ate on average 500 calories more, which is as expected. It's much easier.
And that's just naturally too. That's just like naturally they didn't try to. It was just based on what they naturally ate. They consumed around 500 extra calories.
There was increased consumption of carbohydrates, which many ultra-processed foods are high in carbohydrates, and fat. What I found particularly interesting was these changes were not seen in protein. So protein consumption stayed around the same, which we'll talk about this a bit more later, but protein is more satiating. And it's been found that you're less likely to overeat protein because it's a bit more satisfying. So I just think that's a good point to call out there. They also found that weight changes were highly correlated with energy intake. Again, this is not a cause and effect. We're talking about associations here. However, what we can pull from this, and there have been other studies that have replicated this, is that it's very easy to overeat on an ultra-processed diet. And that's as expected. It's nice to have these examples of good quality studies to kind of show this is likely to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not it's not these ultra processed foods on their own that's negative. It's like the second and third order consequences of them. It's not the first order. Eating a Reese's is not going to make you gain weight. It's the second order consequence, the third of you're going to probably eat more. It's not going to fill you up. So you're going to overeat later. Things like that. So I think, and this is a huge one too, because I think so many coaches are forced on someone coming in, trying to lose weight. It's like, okay, where can we take away? Where can we enter a calorie deficit? What foods can we take away? When it's like, I think if you get this just by now, and what we're going to continue saying, let's add in the whole foods. Let's add in the protein, what we're talking about later, because naturally, if you add in the whole foods first, if you add in the protein with the satiating effect that we're talking about next, if you add these things in first, your body just naturally will not be able to consume all these extra foods because you're just not hungry. There's a big difference when you're going into a room full of chips and snacks and happy hour, whatever, when you're just stuffed and your body's like, man, I'm not hungry. I do not want to eat, because you filled yourself up on whole foods, high protein foods, versus if you're just trying to eat these highly processed foods, you're just going to naturally consume more because your body has these hunger cues that say, I could use a little more. I could use a little more.
Again,
it doesn't turn that off.
And again, these people, when you're doing this, you're not on some diet. You're not restricting your calories. It is very important to implement these strategies, not restricting and saying, I can't have carbohydrates. I can't eat that much. I can't listen to my hunger. It won't work if you have that mindset, because then you are going to have hunger at place. You are going to have cravings at place, and it's really going to hinder your success at actually being able to do this. And I think that's a really important factor to consider.
Yeah.
And it's especially important if you do have a history of like any disordered eating or crash dieting, yo-yo dieting. We really got to get to a place where
Big time.
don't have those outside thoughts and behaviors affecting our ability to adhere to this.
I think it's exacerbated by all the people like labeling bad foods and good foods. If I want to lose weight, I can't have sugar because I'm going to eat the whole bag of Oreo. Whatever it is, if I have one Oreo, I'm going to have the whole bag. Don't tell yourself you can't have the Oreos. Don't tell yourself you can't have XYZ. Tell yourself, I can have those. I just got to do these things first and see naturally how much you actually want to consume those things that you've told yourself this entire time you can't have, you shouldn't have. I have no control over this.
Yeah.
And I think you'd be pretty surprised, don't you?
I think about this often, and I talk about this with my clients often, how it really is crazy. And even how we're talking about this and how you have to talk to yourself, it's like speaking to a toddler or a child or your inner child, because it really, when you think about it, it's the basics. If you can't talk about it to yourself like that, think about how you would coach a younger kid on eating food, and kind of how you would instruct them to do it.
Seriously.
And it's crazy how, as adults, so many people, and a lot of this is diet culture driven, have to reteach themselves how to understand what their body is telling them to eat. it is really fascinating to me. And that's why there's this whole field of research and education and expertise in behavior change. It really is insane.
So let me add you on this too. Well, just to take away before we move into point 3, they know now whole foods should probably be the priority in your diet. Ultra processed foods, not inherently bad, but they shouldn't be an ultra processed diet. I've heard a lot, and I want to get your opinion on this, of people saying you got to go the 80-20 rule. 80% whole foods, 20% processed. I like it and I don't like it because it's a very loose rule. It could really mean whatever. It can be interpreted however. What would you tell people? I'm leaving today. How much can I have of high processed foods before it becomes a problem? Because a lot of people I don't think understand that piece. What would you tell them?
80-20 rule, I never use it. This is a personal opinion. For some people, it works out great and that's fine. But it is an arbitrary number because it's really hard. You can't get an exact of what that looks like from person to person. And are we talking each day, each week, each month? What are we talking here? What if I'm on vacation? It's really tough. So that's why going back to the don't restrict idea is important, and can it be applied here? So I always say the goal, and again, we're not saying do all of these things all at once. Start off small, even if the goal is, okay, I want to do this. I'm going to center two of my larger meals a day around this balanced plate method, focusing on portion sizes. And then we want to work up to like at least 3. And again, if you only have 2 bigger meals throughout the day, that's totally fine. Still aim for 2. And then how you fill that in with your hunger. Again, if we have our hunger at bay with these meals that are higher in whole foods, okay, I want to have a snack throughout the day. I'm going to have one of those smaller bags of chips. That's awesome. I can make that decision. I'm not going to overeat them. And people are probably listening, can you give me a more concrete answer? And there really isn't a more concrete answer. Have our bigger meals be focused around whole foods. Maybe 1 or 2 of our smaller snacks a day are we want to have the cookies or we want to have the chips. That's an arbitrary number, but I would typically say like one or 2 snacks, but I hate to give a specific number.
Yeah. So maybe let's start by focusing around our bigger meals of the day. And we're going to talk about paying attention to your progress too. If you notice that you're doing that, but you still feel like you're over consuming, increase the amount of whole foods, try and decrease the amount of processed foods a little bit, right? If you're not making progress, if you keep finding yourself, that magic number isn't going to be the same for everybody. So try what you would consider 70, 80%, whatever you would consider that to be, because it's impossible to be exact. And then do that for a month. If you're not noticing progress, maybe increase it. Start to make that third meal. Do you think that's a good way to start?
Focus. We don't want to get caught up in the nuances. So really put your time and your energy into those larger meals, and say if you are only sticking to 1 serving of that plate, and you find that, I'm actually having 3 or 4 snacks throughout the day, I feel really peckish, maybe I need to have 1.5 or even 2 plates. Let's see how that works. Now I'm only having 1 serving of chips because I'm actually pretty full. I'm pretty satisfied. This is awesome. Again, it is trial and error, but using that to guide you, looking at your meals throughout the day. Yesterday, I literally forgot to eat until 5 p.m. and now I'm on the couch and I've already eaten a whole bag of chips. I know what I'm going to do tomorrow. I'm going to try and have breakfast or lunch and dinner. It's little things like that.
It seemed like a lot of these too are coming back to just paying attention to these things. It's coming back to paying attention. So number 3, let's jump into it with the satiation. This is my favorite place to start.
Yeah, take it away, Tony.
Is protein, right? This is my favorite place for a client. So I'm excited for you to dive into this. This is what I always start with clients is a lot of times before we even set up, even if their goal is the fat loss and they're like, okay, set up my deficit. Where are we at? And the first goal I give them is like, let's see, we're at around 120 grams of protein. Let's hit 160 for 2 weeks. And then we'll talk about your calories. And they usually notice by increasing their proteins, like, oh, dang, my overall intake went down. So we're talking about number 3 here.
Yeah.
Increase your MF in protein. Center your meals around protein. This is a great freaking way to naturally put that guardrail up. Protein's good. Where can we start structuring this in our day?
I feel like I sound like a broken record, but I would say minimum of 3 times a day have a good high quality protein source. Like minimum. Most people it's like probably 4 or 5, I would say.
It depends on where your intake's trying to be. Because I mean, mine's around 200 grams. So if I don't have like 4 high protein meals, I'm
and
totally
this is tough
screwed for the
again.
day.
Like there's
But I think for most people,
protein, like we are in this case again, we are not talking about tracking. So that's why I say like times per day to add in a protein source. If you have specific goals, if you're getting ready for a competition, no, that's not who we're talking to. If you already know you have a really hard time eating your protein, you know how much you need, and you're tracking it, again, that's different. How you get that in.
I like what you put in the paper, right? Let's just center it around this. Make your meals protein focused first. When you're building out your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, whatever meals you have for the day, I think it's safe to say that's a good starting place is think protein first
what is my
and build the
protein
rest
source?
around there. Don't think, oh, I want to have some salad and some fries and some this and some whatever. It's like, okay, what's the protein of the meal? Then build, do I want chicken? Do I want salmon? Do I want steak? Do I want beef? Then build everything else around that. Would you say that's a good place to start? Like make protein the focus.
And it can be as simple as that.
There.
Like look at your meals throughout the day. How many of them have a protein source? Okay, well, if just one of them do, we know what to change. It's little things like that. It doesn't have to be like a set, like this amount at this time. Let's start by looking at how many of my meals actually have a protein source.
So start by building it from protein first. This is for me, more than even just whole foods, having a higher protein intake, at least anecdotally what I've noticed, just fills me up more than anything else. If I have a full day of 200 grams of protein, the odds I can even stomach anything else is pretty freaking low. Like it's not usually going to happen. So I think maybe a good place is, start there. And if you notice that you're still getting starving through the day sometimes, look at your snacks. The more protein you can try and squeeze and, oh, this is a high protein version of yogurt, the Oikos Greek 15 or 25 grams
Little
versus my regular
like
yogurt.
That. Let's pair that with fiber, but we'll talk about that next.
I think we could even see, because the protein one's not that massive. I think both on our social medias, I know on mine, I have a list of protein options. I think you do too. It's like just find high protein options.
Oh my God.
There's not a best source, right? Just find what you freaking like. Just start putting protein everywhere, because that's...
If you're having a protein source at each meal, and this can be beans, this can be tofu, this can be any sort of like soy product, whether it's tempeh, whether it's a high protein burger, whether it's vegan protein powder. Don't worry about getting a complete or incomplete protein, because when you combine them all together, you're going to make a complete protein, and that's not a worry you should have, especially for vegans. If we have any vegans listening to us here, it is harder to get in your protein. It just naturally is, because you need to eat more to get a standard serving of, say, if you're comparing beans to chicken. You might have to pay a little bit more attention there. If you say you have some beans, okay, I'm also going to have some tofu as well, but getting a variety of protein is a little bit more important if you are vegan or vegetarian. Just like to add that in.
Walk before you can run. Hit your protein goal before you realize, oh crap, could I optimize my tofu for this or X? Walk before you can run. Start increasing your protein before you worry about where it's coming. It's too much. So walk before you can run. Protein there, and then just with satiety. If you notice, most of these things that we're talking about, the whole foods, limiting processed foods, the protein, we're about to talk about fiber. A lot of these are just increasing and adding the foods that fill you up. So next we're going to be talking about
and also leave you
fiber,
satisfied.
which has I
want to make that clear. You can feel physically full and not be satisfied. So that's like, you could feel physically full from just eating a huge bowl of fibrous veggies. However, you may not be satisfied. That protein is super high on the satiety index, whereas the veggies are not as high. So that can be important, because if you still have that mental hunger, you don't feel satisfied. That's why, again, going back to how you build your plate is super, super important. You can still overeat when that happens, especially if you have a history of telling yourself, no, I can't eat that.
So let's talk about fiber. Because we could honestly probably do a whole freaking episode on fiber in gut health. But let's talk about it in forms of helping us eat naturally less food. I know we were talking about this with Bill too. I know we're talking about not tracking, but if you just pay attention to how much fiber most people are getting in a day. I don't know if it's just America or worldwide. It's so low. It's so low.
I want to be specific here about talking about soluble fiber in terms of its impact on satiety and hunger. So soluble fiber forms a gel-like solution in your stomach. And that distension, so if you have that, it slows gastric emptying. It slows digestion. So for insoluble fiber, that fiber moves through you a lot more quickly. So when you have the soluble fiber and your stomach is expanding, it's forming that gel-like solution, those stress receptors signal your brain of the stretch that, oh, I'm getting full, which is really fascinating. And so that's one effect, but also delaying the gastric emptying process can help reduce your feelings of hunger as well and increase your feelings of fullness. So that's a big point. There's two different types of fiber, soluble fiber versus insoluble fiber.
So where do we find soluble versus insoluble?
Like,
do you have any examples of what to look
fiber
for?
Of like, think about apples, or chia seeds are a great source of soluble fiber. Broccoli, insoluble fiber, think of celery or iceberg lettuce. So when you're thinking about like dark leafy greens, fruits with skin on them, beans, and then again, there's some that fall under both categories.
So soluble focus, insoluble is not bad, but make sure you're amping up. How much do you think would be a good goal for people to start aiming for? And I know it's different for everybody, an upper limit, but at least a minimum. Where do you think people should try and get to for fiber
I
every
would
day?
say again, we're not tracking, so I don't want this to be, I'm actually not going to say grams focused, but 2 to 3 servings of vegetables per day.
Fiber.
I think cruciferous vegetables are a great example. So if you're thinking about like cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and then dark leafy greens are super high in fiber. So again, if you're following, okay, I'm going to try and get half of my plate to be some veggies at each larger meal, you'll hit your fiber intake. Add color into your meal. Add a variety of vegetables.
Beautiful.
I honestly think the number for women is like 25 grams, and then for men is 30 grams per day.
Beautiful. So yeah, so even just looking at how much fiber you're getting, servings per meal, if you don't have a few servings of vegetables like that, you're probably going to be a little bit low. And that's where I think it feeds into the high processed diets as well. Highly processed foods rarely have any fiber in them. So if you're eating out a lot, if you're eating a lot of high processed packaged foods, that's usually where, if we look at, I know for some clients before coming in with highly processed diets, we'll look at their fiber. It's like 2 grams all day. It's like, wait a second. It's like, well, how's your time on the toilet looking?
I'd say seeds, like nuts and seeds, are the easiest way to get in fiber because you don't have to eat as many of them. Again, you don't want to be having a ton of nuts. They are more calorie dense, but that's why I say like under healthy fats, nuts fall under there. So around 2 tablespoons, but 1 tablespoon of chia seeds has 5 grams of fiber. 2, that's 10. Like you could have some chia seed pudding in the morning with 2 or 3 tablespoons, and you're at half of your fiber. Add in some berries, like.
That's what first thing I usually do with clients is like look at some, okay, add some blackberries, and then, oh, you already eat Greek yogurt for the protein?
Yeah.
Add 2 tablespoons of chia seeds right there. The blackberries, that's like 17, 18 grams of fiber.
Yeah, but be careful because you don't want to have too much.
Boom. I think we honestly should do a whole episode on fiber. Get to your minimum, but it's not like a more is better kind of thing. People rarely, if you're increasing and I think this is a perfect lead into NEAT or non-exercise movement. If you're increasing your fiber significantly without increasing your NEAT, if you're just sitting down all day and that's what you stay doing, it can make problems, especially from a digestion standpoint, much worse. If you increase too fast or without it. Which can be a really good
thing, but again, I'm not saying to go like overload on fiber and have most of your meals be based around that because it can lead to a lot of GI distress. And if you are listening to this and you do have IBS, soluble fiber can actually cause IBS flares. So it's going to be a little bit more important for you to think about which foods maybe make you feel more uncomfortable. If you're like, oh my God, I eat so much broccoli or so many leafy greens and I'm always uncomfortable, okay, maybe we cut that back a little bit. So again, there are differences there and we could talk about that in a whole other episode, but I like to, my fellow IBS people.
Yeah, but I think that leads perfectly into...
I feel you.
You feel it. Shout out to the fallen homies. The last point I think we got on here, right? We've talked mostly about controlling your diet, right? Being in a calorie deficit, but remember, what's the second one outside of NEAT?
This is added on to fiber, which I think is still important to mention.
Continue with it.
The thing about high fiber foods is they're also a bit higher in volume. So what I was talking about with strawberries is you can eat a lot more of them for less calories. And again, this is not something, I know for some people with a history of disordered eating or are still struggling with that can be very, I hate this word, but it can be very triggering to think like that in terms of eating the lowest amount possible, but feeling like full almost. Like, I know that can be tough. these foods are more filling and I can eat a little bit more of them, that's awesome because I want to feel satisfied, not like this is all I'm going to eat type of thing. Like, it's okay if
Yeah, I feel like that really comes into play, especially when I see a lot of in like bodybuilders, dieting, competition prep, in disordered eating habits. It's like it's an obsession with volume food. It's like if it's not a high volume, low calorie meal, it's not going in their mouth, which is not usually a healthy way to live. But again, if you're approaching it from the standpoint you want to, right? Like this is a great tactic. It's like, well, obviously, a whole bowl full of berries, right, with the same amount of calories as 2 handfuls of chips is probably going to be a little bit better just from filling you up from the satiety standpoint. It's a useful tool, but just like everything, don't obsess over fiber. Don't obsess over protein. Don't obsess over volume eating. It's another tool. Look for those meals and throw them in your day.
Choosing to have those more like high calorie dense foods like cookies, like if you're really craving them and you're excited to eat them and you want them and you've been thinking about them and you could just have 2 or 3 because you've been eating throughout the day, that's way more important than suppressing that craving, because then it just gets higher and higher, and the more you restrict, the harder it gets to control those cravings. So there is a time and place where mentally you can satisfy your craving for cookies or chips.
But the high volume plays, it just does help. And I think if anyone's gone through a successful dieting phase, they can really attest to like when they've made certain food swaps where they realize, oh, I could do this for a lot lower calories. It fills me up a lot more. They realize how big of a difference that can make in certain scenarios. Or adding something into meals like veggies again. Take up half your freaking plate, right? Going to fill you up, but you're still getting a ton of other pieces in that meal. Look at those high volume things you can add to each piece. And again, another thing at restaurants, I think when you eat out too much, restaurants and when you eat out, typically you're not seeing any sort of high volume, lower calorie options. Hardly ever. So in eating out more, and this could almost be another point, the more you eat out, the more challenging it's going to be to stick to all these guidelines that we're trying to put in place. Would you say so? I think it's a challenge.
I think it's important to note this really fascinating study that followed 74 women for 2 years, one of which was assigned a diet that was lower energy density, so eating more whole foods. They had no calorie limits. They were just based around eating more whole foods, while the others, I think it was just lowering their fat intake. There were no guidelines on eating less processed foods and eating more whole foods, high volume foods. They followed up with these women again after, and they lost on average, they lost on average 4 kilograms. Another 2 years later, they followed up with them because, again, with dieting and restriction, one of the biggest issues is weight regain. And their results were of eating these more lower energy density, high volume foods were associated with long-term weight maintenance. So 78% of the participants that lost weight kept the weight off, which is huge. And again, there's only 74 people. But I think that's really important to know because there's very few long-term studies. Again, this wasn't a randomized control style, which has its limitations. But yeah.
But that's a huge piece of it. Is if you like, it's losing weight's not the important part. It's keeping the weight off. I think people that have gone through weight loss and weight regain will tell you that 100 times. It's the most frustrating thing in the world because losing weight is hard. Whether you do it in a more sustainable pace like we're talking about, or even if you do a crash diet, either way. Losing weight's hard. It's not going to be easy losing significant weight. Keeping it off can be almost as challenging, if not more challenging. So if you do it in the sustainable approach, keeping it off is not that much harder than losing it in the first place. It's usually a lot easier. If you're going through the crash, recycle like that, crash and regain, keeping it off is almost impossible. And it's harder most times than even the weight loss in the first place because it takes longer. It takes those ingrained behavioral changes that you did not take the time to do because no one wants to lose 20 pounds in the next 3 months. They want to lose 20 pounds and keep it off for the rest of their life or whatever it is. That's the real goal. I freaking love that study. Even though it is smaller scale, I think it does speak volumes. Now, I think most of the points we've had so far, I don't know if it's 4 or 5, I lost count, right? The looking at portioning your plate, paying attention to your hunger cues, adding in whole foods before processed, adding in protein and structuring your meals around there, looking at your soluble fiber intake, aiming to get 4 servings of that per day, and then those higher volume foods that you can add in. It's all been diet surrounded. So the one piece that we are going to also talk about, because a calorie deficit, like we talked about in that last episode, doesn't just come from your nutrition. That's one piece of the 2-part puzzle. Calories in versus calories out, which if you've noticed, we have not mentioned once that you should just increase your cardio
Because
at the gym if you want to stay in a calorie deficit. That's not what we're talking
the
about.
part that people struggle the most.
Diet's going to be the hardest thing to control. So the last piece we think we can do easily is increase your NEAT, right? Explain what is NEAT, one, if they rudely ignored our last episode, and then 2, some good goals we can set in place and why they're important.
Your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I hate saying that like out loud because it's like, okay, what is that?
I know it's like that gives me nothing. That gives me no input, but that's what it stands for. NEAT.
On our last episode, but it's basically all of the movement that you're doing throughout the day that isn't structured exercise. This is like walking, if you're cleaning, if you're pacing around on your feet, fidgeting. I always think it's so cool that people with ADHD have a higher NEAT on average than people who don't, because you're fidgeting, you're moving around a lot, you can't sit still. And it helps you think about, oh, that's what this is. But it's not like going to the gym, working out.
Yeah. It's the most malleable piece of that puzzle, right? It's where most people could increase their calorie output without increasing their hunger, without increasing their recovery time. It's the easiest and most malleable piece. So as far as people wondering, it's like, okay, I can get my head around the protein, get my head around the other pieces. What can I do in place, or what can I start doing to increase my NEAT? Like what specifically could we start doing?
I personally like to recommend trying to increase your NEAT in the morning. So before you do anything else, okay, I wake up, first thing I do is go for like a 20-minute walk. And again, this can slowly increase. Even if you wanted to start, if you're very sedentary, your goal can be 10 minutes, and we're going to work our way up to having more of a step goal.
Yeah.
But all right, let's get some walking in first thing in the morning before I do anything else, because one, it's not as hard to put off throughout the day. If you keep saying, oh, I'm going to go for a walk, you get caught up in work, you're doing other things before you know it's 5 p.m. and you're too tired. So getting a walk in, if you have to break that up, like 3 walks throughout the day, but walking is like my number one, like first recommendation to look at your steps.
So walking, people can easily add that in. I was going to say, you can do it in any way.
Yeah.
There's not a perfect way to do it. That's what I always say is like, let's add a 10-minute walk after breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? A timing-based cue. You're going to eat every day. Add a walk to it. Boom, right there. There's 30 minutes of extra walking every day. Look at that. If you wear an Apple Watch,
Wear your
increase
watch
your
around
steps.
your ankle.
Would you say I think steps is by... No, don't freak. I think that's the lamest thing in the freaking world.
When you're walking.
The trend of wearing your Apple Watch on your ankle, right, instead of
It's
your
not going to make a huge
wrist
difference,
to more
but
accurately count your
still,
steps.
It looks stupid.
And it looks like a freaking, like you're on probation.
Well, I'm not saying
It looks like
it
you're
really
on
defeats the
probation.
purpose. Totally true, Tony. Thank you. I'm a hypocrite. I just like the time. But like, they're not accurate.
That's always fine to me. And setting a step count goal, that's what always cracked me up is I know certain people, like if they weren't wearing their Apple Watch or they didn't count their steps, the steps they just took didn't count. I'd be talking to my girlfriend when we first met, when she was bigger into steps, would leave her phone at home and we go on a walk. She's like, crap, I need to get to 10,000 steps per day. We just walked for 45 minutes. We hit your 10,000. You were walking throughout the day. This easily, you were at 8 before we left. 45 minutes of walking just did that. She's like, no, it didn't. I'm like, yes, it did. Yeah. This is an anti-tracking episode. So that would be a huge way. And I think that's where people start to realize, like, okay, if you can even just start with 2 or 3 of these principles that you think would be the easiest to implement in your life right now, I would almost promise over the next month, you see some sort of progress. If it's on the scale, if it's in how your clothes fit, it's how you feel. If you increase your NEAT through the day by adding a couple walks, if you pick some of the dieting methods, if you notice that fiber might be low and you increase it, if you notice that you're not focusing on protein, if you notice you're not paying attention to your hunger cues and portion sizes, pick 1 or 2 of those to really say, okay, for the next month, I'm doing
you
this.
Can do the most successfully. Again, we want to set yourself up for success. Even getting yourself in the habit of, say, if you're just focusing on protein, you're building a habit that is better for your health. Once that becomes consistent, okay, how can we stack on top of a habit I've already established? I talk about habits all the time. But
Yeah. And notice, too, all these things that we talked about today are things that would be very low resistance in adding to your daily routine. Adding in we're not saying go to a new CrossFit gym for 90 minutes 5 times a week that's 5 miles away. We're not saying track everything, buy a food scale, spend 30 minutes a day tracking every single gram of food that you're eating. We're not saying that you need to meal prep 7 days a week, take 2 hours during the week. We're not saying any of that, right? These are all small. That's why I love these things. They're all small changes that you could easily just start paying attention to 7 days a week moving forward.
Oh, I totally agree. And
Would you agree?
That's my...
I freaking love it.
I think if I can have any recommendation, if there's any coaches listening to this, if you're starting your journey, give yourself the least amount of barriers, the least amount of resistance to actually engaging in a behavior that it can be consistent for you and is the most realistic. Because if something sounds like, oh, I really can't see myself doing that, or even working up to that, don't start it yet. You don't want to set yourself up for failure.
Mm-hmm. It's the things you do every day that's going to make a change. So if it's hard for you to do this for 1 or 2 days, what are the odds you're going to do it for the next 60 or 90 days? Pretty low, which is what I love about these. So I think tying that up, we covered all points in adding in. If you didn't listen to the tracking episode, I think even if you are not in a place where it's good for you to track right now, or you don't need to track, I still think it gives you a very good idea of energy balance, of how to set yourself up and those tools during life. This is where you can start to implement. And even if you did listen to the tracking episode, I think, again, like you said, these are all things that even if you're tracking, pay off to do, make tracking a lot easier, sticking to your goals a lot easier. So I think that's a big one.
I want to mention here that this may be good for.
Target them right now.
Target them. If you're coming off and you are struggling because, again, when you're competing and you have physique-driven goals and it's very short term and you restrict a lot and are very restrictive in terms of how much you can eat in a day. If you are struggling with overeating, binge eating, which is very common after competitions, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, but this can also be a really good starting point for you guys as well. So I know I mentioned in the beginning, if you are tracking, if you are getting ready to compete, this may not apply to you, but afterwards, this actually can really apply to you.
Yeah. That's weird that you brought that up. I literally, in my Q&A yesterday, I had never gotten a question like this before, but I got 4 separate people asking me for post-competition. They just got out of competitions. What do I do now? How do I control this? Because it is one of the most rigid states of dieting that you will ever go through in your life, and it ruins a lot of relationships with food. So thinking about continuing to let go a little bit, put these guardrails in place, set your lifestyle up. I think that's a weird target. That's
I
weird.
think about it all the time
Stars
because especially like it's something that's not talked about with men enough, which I hate because they're so underrepresented in the eating disordered eating population. And when it comes to the fitness realm, working out, competitions, like it is not at all talked about enough. So if you are in that silent group over there, hopefully this may help you a little bit.
We hear you. We hear you. Wonderful. Okay, so that's where we're at. Yet again, Tony forgot to mention it in the beginning, but this is a free podcast and always will be a free podcast. So we thank you guys so much for listening. The easiest, simplest way that you guys can support us is just whatever you're listening to this. If it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple, you could rate us in the store. I don't even want to say rate us 5 stars. Just what you actually think. Give us your honest opinion. If it's 5 stars, so be it. That's even better. But that usually helps us the absolute most, and this is and always will be a free podcast. So you know where to find us, fs.pod on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok. Almost forgot that third one because we're a little angry at TikTok right now. It's fitness stuff for normal people on YouTube. We got all the links in our bios. But hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions on it, you can DM Marianna or I. And next we're going to start talking about some workouts. So hopefully you found some joy today. Marianna, do you want to tell everyone that we love them, maybe?
Give us a follow.
You want to take that one? We love you.
We appreciate you.
Thank you guys. We'll talk to you soon.